Joined now by political analyst Professor Andre Duvenhage, who joins us on the line. Good to have you, Prof, and thank you very much for your time. Let's start firstly at this Johannesburg leg of the ATM launch. Of course, one at initial glance would have thought ATM is a rural party with big following in the Eastern Cape, but they've taken the party now and brought it to an urban setting, and seemingly we're able to get a substantial following. Does it, I suppose, get rid of that impression and that perspective about the party being a rural party?
Tabo, I think first we must position the party, and you are quite right. The party is a relative small party, and I will be surprised if they got more than one or two people in the national parliament. But what is clear, there is a market on the radical side of politics, but they will compete with the likes of parties like the EFF, like the ANC, the MK party, and a few other parties. So it's not going to be easy, but I think what we have seen in the Jubilani Amphitheatre is that they were able to bring together a huge number of people, and that is at least an indication of support at a grassroots level. But if you look at their policies, it is extremely radical in terms of the major issues.
Yeah, interesting that you bring that up, putting themselves on the radical side of policy issues. For example, on the crime issue, they're saying, well, we'll take a leaf out of the Russia playbook. They say, look at what Russia did just this past weekend to criminal and terrorists. That would be the stance of the ATM here in South Africa for anyone who would think of conducting any criminal activity.
Yeah, the problem is the moment you went radical, you want to centralize power into the hands of a few people, and you would like to take strong and tough decisions. And we have heard the strong talking of the leadership there, referring to radical land reform, one household, one farm, control of the banking system, doing away with unemployment. These type of things are all very, very radical in terms of the politics. The issues are mainly the same. It's a battle against corruption. It is radical land reform. It's radical economic transformation. It's open education. It's better health. These issues are all standard. But the approach to them are a lot more radical in comparison to, let's say, even the ANC, but even more to parties like the Democratic Alliance, the Freedom Front Plus, Action South Africa, and so on.
How successful in South Africa today would those kinds of policies be? I mean, they're not the only ones. I mean, you would hear, for example, a party that says, when we take over power, we are not going to have a secret ballot. Everybody is going to vote in the open. Why vote in secret? Because everybody must know who you're voting for anyway, right? Or you hear parties that say, we are not going to be politically correct when it comes to our policy on fighting crime. We'll color outside of the line. So to speak, forget human rights. We'll throw that all out. So parties making that kind of campaign promise, how successful do they think they'll be in South Africa?
Well, Tabo, my own assessment is they are not going to be very successful. You will always have a 5 or a 10% of people that are tending towards extreme radical approaches in politics. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a huge competition for these markets, like the EFF and other parties. But the approach you mentioned earlier is unconstitutional. It's not in line with basic democratic principles. And when it comes to the rules of the game for a free and fair election, it is absolutely so that you must vote in privacy. You cannot vote in the open because then you will be an immediate target for intimidation. That you need to have rules, especially in a country like South Africa, where conflict and violence are very prominent. So I can in no way agree with that, and I believe the ordinary citizen in South Africa becoming accustomed to our democratic practices
the way the electoral systems are working, and so on. He's not going to accept that type of thing. So I think radical politics will have its limits, and I think we are going to see some of this during the election, although, as I mentioned in the beginning, there is a market for populism and also radical populism, but I think that is not so a big market, and there's going to be big competition in that market.
So the ATM styles itself as a party that says, although we are a small party, fairly small, 2 seats in that parliament, but we've managed to elevate critical issues in that parliament around President Cyril Ramaphosa, around the Office of the Public Protector, around what's happening in our SOEs and so on and so forth, saying we've been very successful in a sense in elevating those conversations, those discussions, and making the party visible. How successful has that strategy been for them?
Well, I think it is always important for a party to emphasize their successes. And the ATM is a relative new party coming on the scene only in 2019, as you mentioned, 1 or 2 members in the National Assembly. And I think if you look at the impact of such a few people, and I think it's basically one person that is there, it did play a role. And it is important, especially with regard to issues like the Pala thing and other things against specifically Ramaphosa. It seems as if the ATM targeted Ramaphosa specifically and the Ramaphosa government. In that sense, they activated a number of processes during the 6th administration. In that sense, successful. But again, we must ask the question, did they influence the outcome of these processes in a dramatic way? And the answer is no. They activated, but they didn't fulfill these processes. And in order to fulfill democratic processes and complete them, you need the power, you need the numbers. And unfortunately, the ATM doesn't have these powers, and unfortunately, I believe they won't be able to get it in the national election of 2024. I think they will stay a smaller party as they are at the moment, and they will more or less follow the same strategy as was the case during the 6th administration.
There's a very, I suppose, not quite unique, but at least something that sets the ATM apart, maybe largely from the EFF, because I believe in analysis, of course, you've got to look at who is saying what they are saying. And if you look at Vuyo Zungula, is a leader very much associated with the EFF. He speaks at all their rallies, even with the Marikana commemorations he's put on the program. So very much close to that party, but also a leader also looked at being very much linked to former President Jacob Zuma. So he speaks of faith leaders shaping the discourse when it comes to the moral compass of the country, saying they need to be given a bigger role to play, and traditional leaders being given a bigger role to play as far as that is concerned. Is this idea of bringing back traditional leaders in the broader politics of the country beginning to gain momentum?
Well, there's no doubt that there is a shift in our politics away from, let's call it, the more broad church inclusive type of approaches we have seen within the ANC and also to a certain extent within the Democratic Alliance towards stronger identity type of politics. And this is very close in line with the bigger fragmentation of the process. And the moment you talk identity, then traditional values and traditional leadership is strongly coming into play. And also where you work with small margins, where it's not that sure that the ANC will achieve an absolute majority. even a small identity group that is normally strongly mobilized can make a difference. And we have seen that with coalition politics at the local level, where small parties are playing above their weight class, to put it in that way. And I think that is part of the strategy of the ATM. In the beginning, you mentioned that they came from a rural base, and therefore the rural traditional orientation will be important to them. But we have seen over the weekend that they can mobilize people in an urban area as well. But you're correct in terms of the association with Jacob Zuma and also with a close relationship with the EFF, because their policy approaches and that of the EFF is very close to each other. But the moment you work with identity politics, and when it comes to KZN, there's a clear, strong identity, and that is a Zulu identity. That identity becomes dominant, and that is one of the reasons why the EFF is not performing so well in KZN as is measured in the most recent surveys.
So let's look then at the space of manifestos. I mean, I don't know if you have heard anything particularly different in terms of solutions, especially when we're talking the economy, on all the manifesto launches that would have even taken place this past weekend. I mean, even the ANC itself will tell you, in terms of transforming the economy, they'll speak of localization, they'll speak of set-asides. It differs in terms of percentage. Another one says 80%, another one says 50%. They'll speak of manufacturing. They'll speak of opening factories everywhere. They'll speak of a digital economy.
You know,
what is going to be different for a voter? What is going to be different for me to say, well, I believe those ones are going to implement it?
I'm on record saying that the manifesto of a political party in the South African political context at the moment is not a critical factor in mobilizing support. Rather, it's about the leadership. It's about what people can get from the system in terms of grants and other forms of support or whatever they would like to define it. These are the factors. The policy details are not that important. And it's very interesting, and I have analyzed basically all the political parties that had election manifestos thus far. And all of them are working down to the same basic issues. They have certain perspectives with regard to the state and the concept of rule of law, with regard to corruption, land reform, the question of unemployment, the question of poverty, these type of things, the questions of local government in some ways, inequality, the banking system, and when it comes to the financial world. These are all the issues parties are addressing. But their spin, their political spin on these issues differ from the one to the other. And I believe, honestly, that the average voter in South Africa won't be able to pick up these differences. But they will know that Julius Malema made a presentation there, that Jacob Zuma's MK party was active in this area, and they will probably see some of the posters of the Democratic Alliance and recognize John Steenhuisen or whatever the case may be. I think our election campaigns are rather on that level, and it doesn't have a lot to do with high intellectual academic thinking about politics, about policies, the content of policies, and the details of how a party would like to address major issues.
Prof, we appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining us.